In this video, I'm going to describe how you get started on your pre-visualization. The steps involved, at least at this stage, are to open your skull file, then place your tissue depth markers, place the eye, and also place a reference cube for calibration when we get into Photoshop. So you can see here I've got an empty Maya scene open. Now I don't have a project set yet for my skull model, but I'll do that now. So I'm just going to open a scene and navigate to wherever you downloaded that Maya file to. Mine is still in the Dropbox folder. Maya's not cooperating with me. Let's just go straight in here. So first things first, we've got the skull. It's been sized appropriately. The mandible's been placed, and I've added these tissue depth markers for you. But before we do anything else, let's set a project and save this appropriately. So File, Project, New, and I'm just going to browse my desktop and you can call it what you like as long as it's sensible. For me, just CFR 2013. Under Scenes, we want a folder called Maya, Images, Renders, Source Images, Text, and down here, Textures, Text. Accept, and then we'll do Save As, and shortcut is Command-Shift-S. Make sure we're saving as an MA file, and just double check it's going to the right place, the Maya folder within your project. Great. So, and the other thing to check too is go into the Save Scene options and make sure incremental save is turned on. So now, let's just take a look at what we have here. You can see that I can't select the skull at all, the mandible or the cranium. And if we look down here in the lower right, you can see I've got two display layers in the channel box. And remember, these buttons up here in the top right will take you to the channel box, the attribute editor, or the tool display. We want the channel box open. I have nothing selected, but you can see down here I've got my layers, my display layers, and I've got the skull on its own layer and the mandible on its own layer, and I can turn the visibility on or off. But you can see there's also an R here. That means they're in reference mode, which will make any object on those layers visible but not selectable, which is what we want. So for this project, you have to do a few things. Now, you have to place your tissue depth markers. So I've made enough blue ones here for the midline markers. I haven't named them. You can do that yourself. If you select one of these in the channel box, you'll see it's called TDM_M1. I can click on that name and change the name to something like glabella or whatever marker it is that you're placing. Now if I hit W to go into move mode, you can see I've got my little icon for moving this object around. And it's placed at the base of the object. Now it's that base that you want to place on the skull, because eventually we'll also have to rotate it so it's pointing perpendicular from the surface, or in some direction from the surface, but you want it sitting on the surface in any case. And we also will have to end up scaling this in the Y direction for the tissue depth. Now you'll notice that when I hit R to go into scale, I get this manipulator, and I can grab just one of these cubes, to drag it in a single axis. If I grab the one at its base, it scales it uniformly in all directions. We don't want that. We want to leave it the same diameter, this cylinder, but we want to lengthen it along its long axis. So if we select this green cube here, if I hit the plus key on my keyboard, it will make that manipulator handle a little bigger. It's green, but when I select it, it turns yellow. The active handle that you're using will turn yellow. So I only want to drag it in that direction to scale it up and down. So if I want to move it onto the skull, I can press W to go into move mode. And I would recommend doing this from the front and side views first. So I've got it selected here. It's behind the skull, but if I drag it out here, drag it up here to around the height of the brow ridges, pull it over to where glabella is, the most anterior point on the frontal bone along the brow ridge line. So you can see I'm working from the front to the side view. And now when I have it roughly in the right position, I want to hit rotate and rotate it out. Now I don't want to just grab anywhere in this rotate sphere, but you can see there are these colored lines, and we want to rotate it by grabbing this darker blue line. The light blue line allows you to rotate it along your camera view. Whatever view you have, it'll be use your camera view as the axis around which it rotates. But the blue line will lock it into rotation around the z-axis, which in this case is what we want. So I'm going to rotate that. W. Now if I grab this yellow box in the move mode, then I can freely move it in the X and Y axis. So let's say it's going to be something, this is maybe the most anterior point, but usually glabella would be found on the brow ridge here. So I'm going to place it something like that. Now this is the same skull that you're using. I'm not being very careful. I'll encourage you to be more careful than I am. But you have to zoom in to get as close as you can and place it right on the surface. Now these are digital virtual models, so there's nothing preventing them from passing through one another. So you want to get it on the surface. This is a curved surface, the skull, so it'll penetrate partly stick out, but you want it right on the surface. Now I don't have my tissue depth marker chart with me, but you'll look up glabella and all the other ones, and you want to change it to the right dimension along the y-axis. So if we look over here in the channel box, you can see we've got translate, rotate, and scale with the cylinder selected. And what we're interested in here is scale X and scale Z. Scale Y, scale. We're interested in these scale measures, X, Y, and Z, but here we want to change scale Y and leave the other two alone. So let's say glabella is 5 millimeters. Now, please note that these measures are in centimeters. The rotation measures, of course, are not in centimeters, but in degrees. But for scale, we've got a value of 1 here equals 1 centimeter. So if we change it to 0.5, you can see that my cylinder is half the length. If we had a tissue depth marker that had a measurement of, say, 2.5 centimeters, we can simply type that into scale Y and we would get that. Now, of course, glabella is not that thick. Let's say it's 0.25. So that would be 2.5 millimeters. And there we go. We've got that one placed. And it's your job to go through and place all of these correctly. The blue ones are on the midline. The red ones are the bilateral ones, so you have to place each one twice. Now let's say we wanted to place gonion, which is at the angle of the mandible. We would select one, call it gonion _R for gonion right, and the one below it, or whichever other one, gonion _L for left, and place those appropriately. Now I'll leave you to do that and refer to the Stefan article that details how these tissue depth markers should be placed and angled. And you can refer also to the Loos-Gibson chapters for information about placing these tissue depth markers, although hers do not refer to all the same ones. But where there is overlap, they'll give you some additional information about how to angle and place them. If there's any discrepancy between the two, I would err on the side of the Stefan article. Now, the other thing we want to do here, once these tissue depth markers have been placed, is to create a cube that we're going to use as a reference object for making sure we have a one-to-one scale when we render out images of the skull for taking into Photoshop and using as a reference for drawing our face. So what we want to do here is to go to the Create menu, Polygon Primitives, and remember, interactive creation is probably turned on. Turn that off. Then go to Create Polygon Primitives Cube, and a cube will be created, but it will be in the middle of the skull, so don't deselect it. Hit W, and we just want to move it out here somewhere. So you can see I'm moving it here in the front view. Now if you did happen to deselect it while it was inside the skull and you had a hard time grabbing it again without selecting other things, you can go to the Window menu and go to the Outliner. So there's a little option for Window Outliner, and the Outliner is the list of all the things in your scene. So you can see all my tissue depth markers are listed here, Gonion that I renamed, and then P cube is the polycube that I just created. So I might double click on this to rename it. I'll call it Ref Cube. And I also want to make it black. And this will become apparent. Why we want to do this will become clear later on. But if you select the cube in your scene and right click on it, and just go down here in this contextual menu to assign new material, you might not see all these same options that I have here, but ultimately you just want to travel up almost to the top to where it says Lambert. Add a Lambert. It's a type of material. And this window should open, and in color, just drag this down to black. We've got a perfectly black cube. Now it's placed appropriately here in the front view, but we want to now go into, the side view. Oh, sorry, this is reversed. This is the front view. And we just want to place it so it's not overlapping with the skull in any way. So when we render an image of this skull from this side, and then render it from the front, it will be visible in both cases. Now the last thing we want to do is place the eyeball. Now I don't think I have an eye here ready, so I'm just going to save this shot, this scene. And I'm going to create a new file. Now you don't have to do this because you've already created your eye. But I don't have mine here. So you have a nicely shaped eye that will match a real eyeball. I'm just going to quickly make a sphere. And remember that the eyeball is about 2.4 centimeters in diameter. This is a little small, so just scale it up till it's about that size. So 1.2. So something like that. Make sure I name it eye. And again, you've already done this part. I am going to save this in that same area where I had my skull just saved. You see, I didn't have to set the project for this one because I set it earlier when I opened the other file, and it will remember this project. So I'm going to save this here and then quickly just open up that last scene. With the skull and the tissue depth markers. Now it should open again with our changes from last time with the cube in place and with glabella already placed. So once you've placed all these tissue depth markers, you want to import the eye model. So to do that, we go to File, Import, and we can open up the options, and file type should say Best Guess. Just go to Import, select Eye, import the eye, and it looks like nothing has happened, but it's actually in the middle of the skull here, I imagine. Oh yeah, oh there it is, down there. And then it's up to you to place the eye appropriately. Now we talked about this in class, that we're placing this centrally but slightly up and to the left. So I'll leave you to do that, but you want to do this in the front view and get it placed correctly. It's going to be something like that. Now we could measure this a little more precisely here in Maya, but for now, let's just get it approximately where we need it to be. And in another video, I'll talk about explaining it, placing it exactly. Here, I just wanted to import it and rough it in. You can see it's not in the right position here in this view. Now you can see I'm going into the eye on the orbit on the other side. Here our little navigation cube can come in handy. You can see there's the home button that will take us back to the front view, but if I press on one of these arrows here, it will take us around the back. Press it again, it will take us to the other side. So we can use that to place this. And again, we're going to look at how we place this appropriately with using the rules that we've learned from our readings. But it's going to be something like this with a tangent passing through the cornea, somewhere between the outer extent of the cornea and the iris or the limbus. Then we can go back to our regular view. And then we want to duplicate this eye, because of course there are two eyes. And to do that, we can just hit Shift D with the eye selected and then drag it over to the other orbit. And of course you'll have to place it in both views to match the rules that we're using to do this. And because bilateral symmetry is not perfect in the human face, you can see this orbit is a little bit bigger, it looks like. You'll have to place the eye a little bit differently. But luckily these orbits are rather square, so assessing where the middle is, I think we can do by eye, but we could also measure it, but we'll talk about that in another video. For now, we can just get to this point. So once you've completed this, you should have your tissue depth markers in place, your reference cube, and your eyes roughed in. And when we come back, we'll look at placing the eye more completely and how to render out images of the skull to take into Photoshop to start our drawing. Thanks.